time using Arnold renderer instead of the default scanline renderer. So the main difference between the Arnold renderer and the default scanline renderer is that Arnold is going to imitate real life situation. I was talking about how light works and I went over the basic details, but what happens is when a light ray falls on an object, the light bounces off the object and then falls on another object, and then from there it bounces on another object and then bounces off it onto the other object. So when this bouncing happens, the light loses its intensity a fraction, and it also carries the color information of the bound surface onto the other surface. So for example, if in your house if you have the walls painted red, then most of the objects around in the room will look reddish because the light will bounce off the red walls and that transfer that information onto other objects in the scene. And also what happens when this bouncing happens is that there is a direct light source. For example, the light is coming from a bulb, electric bulb, or from the window, the light comes in. So the direct light falls on an object and then that area is nice and bright, but the other side of the object gets its light from this diffused bounced light. And what happens in the default scanline renderer is that this bouncing of light does not happen. Now here you can see this is rendered in Arnold and there's only one light, and even though there's only one light, the light is bouncing around and you are able to see everything very clearly like what you see in a real life situation. So let us see how to create Arnold lighting for our scene. So I'll just work on this file. There's a light here which I will delete, and everything else is same as in the last scene. I had my car and then I had a plane for the floor. When you want to create a rendering, your object has to have a base and then there has to be a background. So I created another plane and then I added a camera, and then the plane is approximately parallel to that camera. Alright. So we are going to look at the render setup option here, which is the teapot with the gear, and then the target is going to be active shade. We're going to use active shade because it will allow you to make changes and then interactively update the render screen, so you can see how the rendering affects the values that you change in the light parameters. We are also going to use output size of HDTV, and we're going to use a smaller size because Arnold will take much longer time to render than scanline. So to save our time, we will first render it using a small size, and later on when we are satisfied with the results, we will render a bigger size picture. Okay, so you have to select active shade, Arnold. Viewport has to be camera, it has to be locked. So no matter what viewport you select, it will always render the camera viewport. And then if you hit the render button, you may get a complete black screen. I had a light there and then I deleted the light, so it is assuming that there is some other default light and it is giving me some rendering, but you can see that the rendering is very flat. In the front view, I'm going to go to the create panel, and from the standard primitives we will go to the lights, and we looked at the standard lights in the previous project. Here we are going to use Arnold, and there's only one light to select, and then the options that are there in the standard light, such as target direct, target spot, omni, those options are available in Arnold here, which is quad, distance, spot, disk, point, and so on. Okay, so we'll stick to the quad, and then we'll simply click and drag down to create the light, You go to the modify panel. See, either it is targeted or not targeted. If it is targeted, then you'll get the target, which should be somewhere. And you can see that in the active shade, it is updating and the process is a little slow. Okay, so while rendering, you can see that the shadows are very sharp. That is because of the quad size, the size of the light itself. If you click on the light, you can see there is a box here, and in my case it is 10 by 10. So we'll change these numbers. Maybe you have the number 2 or 1. Let us make a big change. So whenever you are practicing, it's still rendering, you should try to use big numbers and see how it affects. Now it also depends on the scene size. Basically your light has to be as big as the car. Okay, so these number really don't matter, but make sure that the size is as big as the car when I change it. So earlier they were small, tiny, and then you make it as big as the car. In my case it was 10, which has become 100. And now you can see that the shadows soften a little bit. So how about going 1000 by 1000? Okay, and now you get much better, softer shadows. Now you must be wondering why you are not able to see anything on the screen, and in fact I should have covered that first before going there over this. So but if you go down there, my intensity is 30 and the exposure is 12. So by default it should be 8 and 1. So of course there would be no point playing with these numbers in the beginning. We should first look at the intensity and the exposure. Okay, so if you click on the exposure, you will see it gives information. You can read that, but what it says is even if you change the number by 1, the effect is twice the number, the effect of the previous one. So you have to be a little careful about how high you go with the exposure. Okay, exposure is like a camera setting that you have in your camera, but it allows more light to come into the image, thus making the scene, overall scene, brighter if the exposure is high, and if the exposure is low, then less light comes in and the image is darker. So, and then the intensity of the light is how high or how bright the light is, and you will need bigger numbers here to make a big impact. However, you will need smaller numbers in exposure to make a big impact. So let us go from 1 to 10. And you can see that now your car is visible. And if you change the exposure from 8 to 12, the scene becomes brighter. Now if you increase the exposure too much, you're going to start losing the colors. For example, if 12 becomes 20, then you can see that the scene becomes bright, but the colors are washed out. So you should be careful. If you think that the scene is too dark, then you can further increase the intensity of the light. Okay, so this will maintain the colors. You can see only just a slight change. Will make the scene much brighter. So I think 12 is good. The other thing is samples. Now you might be having one or two samples, and that will really give a very grainy shadow. So to increase the quality of shadows, you will need a higher sampling, and you have to be careful about how high you go, because if this number will uh, impact the rendering time, so it will take much longer time to render if the samples are high. The other thing is color. If you click on the color, you can change the color of your scene, so you can add a warmer color. You have to be a little wary about how bright you go with the color, or you can go with a cooler color. So this is more like a sunlight outdoor setting, so the sky will give a bluish tinge to it. So this might look a little better. Okay. So you can play with these numbers. If the spread is 1, if the spread is 0, you can see that. Again, you go back to your shadows being very sharp. So you can play with slight variations in these numbers to, if you want a little different effect for your shadows. Save with the soft edges. If the soft edges is 0, your shadows are going to be even more softer. So if you want to focus more on the object and less on the shadows, then that softness can be 0 or maybe 0.5. So the last thing we are going to do is just to further reduce this blue color, and I'm happy with what I get here. So I'll close this window and then go to render setup. We'll go to our production rendering. The output is HDTV and 1280 by 720. The camera 1 is selected, it is locked, and then hit the render button. And then it is going to render your final scene. So it has nice soft shadows, nice diffuse light, less noise because of our samples, and there is some default. We have not covered materials, so there is also some reflection effect there, but if you don't want that, then that has to be fixed with the materials. But you can feel free to play around with the numbers and see how those change in the numbers affect the rendering to learn further. The next tutorial we will be working on how to create a glass material so that we can render our wine glass. Happy rendering!